Marcus Rivera stepped off the military bus at Fort Henderson. The hot Texas sun beat down on his uniform as he carried his duffel bag toward the main building. Other soldiers walked past him, talking and laughing with each other. Marcus kept his eyes straight ahead and said nothing. It had been 3 months since he left Afghanistan. 3 months since the explosion that changed everything. The doctor said his leg was healing well. The scars on his face were fading, but there were other wounds that nobody could see, wounds that woke him up at night, sweating and shaking. Marcus walked to the admin office to check in. A young clerk looked at his papers and smiled. "Welcome to Fort Henderson, Staff Sergeant Rivera. I see you have a Purple Heart. Thank you for your service." Marcus nodded but did not smile back. He was tired of people thanking him. He just wanted to do his job and be left alone. The clerk handed him a map and pointed to a building across the base. "You report to Lieutenant Colonel Whitman in Building C tomorrow at 800 hours. He runs the logistics unit. Your barracks are in Building H, room 204. Marcus took the map and walked toward his new home. The base was busy with soldiers going about their daily work. Some were young, fresh out of basic training. Others looked older and more experienced. Marcus wondered how many of them had seen real combat, how many of them had watched their friends die. His room was small but clean. 2 beds, 2 lockers, 2 desks. His roommate was not there. Marcus unpacked his few belongings and put them in his locker. His dress uniform hung carefully on one side. His combat boots were polished and ready. On the shelf he placed a photo of his unit from Afghanistan. 8 men standing together, all smiling. Only 5 of them made it home. That night Marcus lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of air conditioning. In Afghanistan, the nights were never this quiet. There was always something happening. Helicopters flying overhead, soldiers on patrol, the distant sound of gunfire. Here the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. In the silence his mind wandered to places he did not want it to go. He thought about the day everything changed. It was supposed to be a simple mission. His squad was escorting supplies to a small outpost. They had done the same route dozens of times before. But this time was different. The roadside bomb was hidden well. When it exploded, their vehicle flipped over 3 times. Marcus remembered waking up with blood in his eyes and dirt in his mouth. His ears were ringing so loud he could not hear anything else. He looked around and saw 2 of his men were not moving. Johnson and Martinez. Good soldiers. Good friends. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to push the memory away. The doctors said it would get easier with time. They said he needed to talk to someone about what happened. But Marcus did not want to talk. He just wanted to forget. The next morning came too soon. Marcus woke up before his alarm, as he always did. His roommate, a young private named Tommy, was still sleeping. Marcus got dressed quietly and went to the mess hall for breakfast. The food was better than what they had in Afghanistan, but Marcus barely tasted it. He ate because he had to, not because he wanted to. Around him, other soldiers talked about their weekend plans and complained about their duties. Their biggest worry seemed to be whether they would get leave time approved. Marcus finished eating and walked to Building C. The morning air was already getting hot. He found Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's office and knocked on the door. "Enter," came a sharp voice from inside. Marcus walked in and stood at attention. Behind the desk sat a man in his 40s with perfectly pressed uniform and not a hair out of place. His office was spotless. Awards and certificates covered the walls. Pictures showed him shaking hands with important people. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman looked up from his paperwork and studied Marcus for a long moment. His eyes moved from Marcus's face to his uniform to his boots and back again. Marcus stood perfectly still and waited. "So you are Rivera," Whitman said finally. His voice was cold and unfriendly. "I read your file. Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, Bronze Star, very impressive on paper." Marcus said nothing. He had learned that it was better to let officers talk first. "But this is not Afghanistan, Sergeant Rivera. This is my unit. Here we do things by the book. Every rule, every regulation, every detail matters. I do not care what you did over there. Here you start fresh. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. Whitman stood up and walked around his desk. He was shorter than Marcus, but carried himself like he owned the world. "I have heard about soldiers coming back from combat thinking they are special, thinking the rules do not apply to them. That will not happen in my unit." Marcus kept his eyes straight ahead. He could feel Whitman studying him, looking for weakness. You will be working in supply management, making sure equipment gets where it needs to go on time. It is not exciting work, but it is important work. Can you handle that? Or do you need to be somewhere more suitable for heroes? The last word came out like an insult. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest but kept his face blank. I can handle it, sir. Good, Sergeant Williams will show you around and explain your duties. You start tomorrow, dismissed. Marcus saluted and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Whitman spoke again. One more thing, Rivera. I run a tight ship here. I expect perfection from every soldier under my command. Do not disappoint me. Marcus walked out of the office feeling like he had been slapped. In Afghanistan, officers respected the men who fought beside them. Here it seemed different. Here he was just another soldier to be managed and controlled. He spent the rest of the day learning about his new job. Sergeant Williams was a good man who had been at Fort Henderson for 5 years. He showed Marcus the supply warehouse and explained how everything worked. The colonel is tough, Williams said quietly when they were alone. But fair. Just do your job and stay out of trouble and you will be fine. Marcus nodded, but he was not so sure. Something in Whitman's eyes told him this assignment was going to be more difficult than he thought. That night, Marcus called his sister Maria back home in Texas. She was the only family he had left. Their parents died in a car accident when they were teenagers. How is the new base? She asked. It is fine, Marcus lied. Just different from what I am used to. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you talking to anyone about what happened? Marcus closed his eyes. Maria worried about him constantly since he came back. She did not understand that talking would not fix anything. Some things were too broken to be repaired. I am fine, Maria. Just focusing on work. They talked for a few more minutes before Marcus said goodbye. He lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He just hoped he was strong enough to face them. Outside his window, the base was settling down for the night. In a few hours, he would start his new life at Fort Henderson. He had survived Afghanistan. He would survive this too. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Whitman arrived at his office every morning at exactly 0630 hours. His routine never changed. First, he reviewed the previous day's reports. Then he checked his uniform in the mirror behind his door. Every button had to be perfect. Every crease had to be sharp. Every detail had to be exactly right. Whitman had spent 15 years in the Army, but he had never been in combat. While other officers were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, he always seemed to get assignments at safe bases in the United States. Some people whispered that he had connections. Others said he was just lucky. Whitman told himself he was too valuable to risk in dangerous places. But the truth was different. The truth was that Whitman was afraid. Afraid of real war. Afraid of real danger. Afraid that he would not measure up when things got serious. So instead of facing his fear, he became the toughest officer he could be at safe bases like Fort Henderson. His unit was known throughout the base for its strict discipline. Soldiers feared being assigned to work under Whitman. He found fault with everything. A spot on a uniform, a minute late to formation, a report filed incorrectly. Nothing was ever good enough for him. Whitman believed that fear made soldiers better. He thought that if his men were afraid of him, they would work harder and make fewer mistakes. What he did not understand was that fear also made soldiers hate him. On Marcus Rivera's first day of work, Whitman watched him through his office window. Rivera moved quietly through the supply warehouse, learning his duties from Sergeant Williams. He did not talk much to the other soldiers. He kept to himself and focused on his work. This bothered Whitman. In his experience, quiet soldiers were trouble. They were either planning something or hiding something. Rivera was definitely hiding something. Whitman could see it in the way he moved, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he seemed to be somewhere else even when he was standing right there. Whitman had read Rivera's military file 3 times. The man was a decorated combat veteran with an excellent record. But Whitman did not care about that. In fact, it made him angry. Here was a soldier who had done things Whitman had never done, seen places Whitman had never seen, earned respect that Whitman felt he deserved more. At 1400 hours, Whitman decided to inspect the supply warehouse. He did not announce his visit. He simply walked over and started examining everything. The other soldiers quickly stood at attention when they saw him coming. Sergeant Williams, Whitman called out, I want to see your inventory reports for the past week. Williams hurried to get the paperwork. Whitman looked through it carefully, searching for any mistake he could find. The reports were perfect, which only made him more frustrated. "Where is Rivera?" Whitman asked. "Loading supplies for transport to Building F, sir," Williams replied. Whitman walked to the loading dock where Marcus was checking items off a list and placing them carefully in a truck. Marcus saw him coming and stood at attention. "Continue with your work, Sergeant," Whitman said. "I am just observing." Marcus went back to loading the truck, but he could feel Whitman's eyes on him. Every move he made was being watched and judged. He tried to ignore it and focus on his job. Whitman walked around the truck looking for something wrong. The supplies were loaded correctly. The paperwork was in order. Everything was exactly as it should be. This made Whitman even angrier. Then he noticed something. One of the buttons on Marcus's uniform was not quite lined up with the others. It was barely noticeable, but Whitman had sharp eyes for such things. "Rivera!" Whitman barked. "Front and center now." Marcus set down the box he was carrying and walked over. He stood at attention and waited. "Look at yourself, Sergeant," Whitman said loudly. Several other soldiers stopped what they were doing to watch. "What do you see?" Marcus looked down at his uniform but could not see what was wrong. "I am not sure what you mean, sir." "Your third button from the top is crooked. In my unit, soldiers take pride in their appearance." "Apparently you did not get that message." Marcus looked at the button. It was slightly off but barely visible. "I apologize, sir. I will fix it immediately." "You will do more than fix it," Whitman said, stepping closer. "You will explain to me how a soldier with your supposed experience can be so careless with basic uniform standards." The warehouse had gone quiet. Every soldier was listening now. Marcus felt his face getting hot, but he kept his voice steady. "No excuse, sir. It was an oversight." "An oversight?" Whitman repeated. "Is that what you called it in Afghanistan when you made mistakes?" "An oversight?" Marcus said nothing. He could see where this was going, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I have seen soldiers like you before, Rivera," Whitman continued. "You think because you have some ribbons on your chest you are special. You think the rules do not apply to you. Well, let me tell you something. Those ribbons do not mean anything to me. What matters is how you perform right here, right now, in my unit." Marcus could feel all the other soldiers watching him. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked embarrassed for him. But none of them would say anything. They were all too afraid of Whitman. "From now on," Whitman said, "you will report to me personally every morning for uniform inspection. It's 30 hours sharp. If I find one thing wrong with your appearance, you will spend the day cleaning bathrooms. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "Good, and Rivera? The next time you decide to be careless with your uniform, remember that other soldiers are watching. They look up to their sergeants. When you fail to meet standards, you are failing them too." Whitman turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone on the loading dock. The other soldiers slowly went back to their work, but Marcus could feel them stealing glances at him. Sergeant Williams came over after Whitman was gone. "Do not let him get to you," he said quietly. "He does that to everyone when they first arrive. Just keep your head down and do your job." But Marcus knew it was more than that. Something in Whitman's eyes told him this was personal. The colonel did not just dislike him. He wanted to break him. That evening, Marcus sat in his room and polished his uniform buttons until they shined like mirrors. His roommate Tommy watched him work. "I heard what happened today," Tommy said. "Whitman is a real piece of work. But most officers here are not like him." Marcus did not respond. He had dealt with difficult officers before, but this felt different. In combat, officers and enlisted men depended on each other. They were on the same side, fighting the same enemy. Here it felt like Whitman saw him as the enemy. The next morning, Marcus reported to Whitman's office at exactly 06:30 hours. He had checked his uniform 5 times before leaving his room. Every button was perfect. Every crease was sharp. His boots were polished so well he could see his reflection in them. Whitman looked him over from head to toe, clearly hoping to find something wrong. When he could not, his face showed disappointment. "Acceptable," Whitman said finally. "But barely. I expect better tomorrow." This became their daily routine. Every morning, Marcus stood in Whitman's office while the colonel searched for flaws in his appearance. When he could not find any, he would make comments about Marcus's performance or attitude. "You seem distracted lately, Rivera. Are you having trouble adjusting to real military life? Your responses are too slow. In my unit, soldiers think fast and act faster. I am not convinced you understand the importance of attention to detail." Marcus endured it all in silence. He had survived worse things than an angry officer, but each day he could feel Whitman's hostility growing stronger. The other soldiers in the unit began to notice the pattern. They saw how Whitman treated Marcus differently from everyone else. They heard the daily criticisms and unnecessary punishments. But they also saw how Marcus never complained or fought back. Some admired his patience. Others thought he was weak for not standing up to Whitman. But all of them understood that crossing the colonel would only make things worse. 2 weeks into his assignment, Marcus was working late in the warehouse when Whitman appeared unexpectedly. It was after 1900 hours and most of the base was quiet. "Still here, Rivera?" Whitman asked. "Having trouble keeping up with the workload?" "Just finishing some paperwork, sir," Marcus replied. Whitman walked over and looked at what Marcus was working on. It was a supply request that had been filed incorrectly by another soldier. Marcus was fixing the mistakes on his own time to make sure the request went through properly. "Whose mistake is this?" Whitman asked. Marcus hesitated. He did not want to get another soldier in trouble. "It does not matter, sir. I am taking care of it." "It does matter," Whitman said sharply. "When soldiers make mistakes, they need to be held accountable." "Who filed this request?" Marcus remained silent. He would not throw anyone under the bus, even to save himself from Whitman's anger. "Your loyalty to incompetent soldiers is admirable, Rivera," Whitman said sarcastically, "but it also shows poor judgment. In combat, covering for weak soldiers gets people killed." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Whitman had no idea what combat was really like. He had never watched good soldiers die because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. He had never made life or death decisions with incomplete information and no time to think. But Marcus said nothing. He finished fixing the paperwork and filed it properly. 3 weeks after Marcus Rivera arrived at Fort Henderson, Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's treatment of him grew worse. What started as daily uniform inspections and harsh words had turned into something much more serious. Whitman seemed to wake up each morning thinking of new ways to make Marcus's life difficult. It began with the work assignments. While other sergeants in the unit were given important tasks that matched their rank and experience, Marcus found himself doing jobs that privates usually handled: cleaning storage areas, moving boxes from one building to another, organizing supply closets that were already organized. "Rivera," Whitman would say during morning formation, "I have a special assignment for you today. The motor pool needs someone to wash vehicles. Since you seem to have trouble with attention to detail, maybe some simple manual labor will help you focus." The other soldiers would look down at their feet when this happened. They felt bad for Marcus, but they also felt relieved that they were not the ones being singled out. Everyone knew that speaking up would only make Whitman turn his attention to them. Marcus accepted every assignment without complaint. He washed vehicles until his hands were raw. He cleaned bathrooms until they sparkled. He organized supply rooms that had been organized just days before. Each task was done perfectly, which seemed to make Whitman even more angry. One morning, Marcus requested a leave form to visit his sister Maria. She had been asking him to come home for a weekend, worried about how he sounded on their phone calls. Marcus filled out the paperwork correctly and submitted it through proper channels. 2 days later, Whitman called him into his office. "Your leave request has been denied," Whitman said without looking up from his desk. "May I ask why, sir?" Marcus asked. "You are too new to this unit to be taking time off. You need to prove yourself first. Maybe in a few months if your performance improves." Marcus knew this was not true. Other soldiers who had arrived after him had already been granted leave. But he also knew there was no point in arguing. "Understood, sir," he said. "Good. And Rivera, in the future, maybe focus less on vacation time and more on doing your job properly." Marcus left the office feeling frustrated and trapped. He called Maria that night to cancel his visit. "What do you mean you cannot come?" she asked. "You promised you would be here for my birthday." "I am sorry, Maria. There is too much work right now. Maybe next month." Marcus could hear the disappointment in her voice. Maria was the only family he had left, and he was letting her down because of Whitman's games. The harassment continued in other ways. During unit meetings, Whitman would ask Marcus questions that had nothing to do with his job, then criticize his answers in front of everyone. "Rivera, what is the current status of supply shipments to Fort Knox?" Marcus would have to admit he did not know, since managing shipments to other bases was not part of his duties. "I see," Whitman would say. So you are telling me you do not know what is happening in your own unit? How can you do your job effectively if you do not understand the bigger picture? It was a trap with no right answer. If Marcus admitted he did not know something outside his area, he looked incompetent. If he tried to guess, he would be wrong and look foolish. Sergeant Williams watched these meetings with growing concern. He had been in the Army for 12 years and had never seen an officer target a soldier so unfairly. After one particularly harsh meeting, he approached Marcus. "This is not right," Williams said quietly. "Have you thought about filing a complaint?" Marcus shook his head. "Who would I complain to? He is the commanding officer. And what would I say? That he gives me extra work and asks difficult questions?" Williams knew Marcus was right. Whitman was careful to stay just within the bounds of military regulations. He never crossed the line into anything that could be easily proven as harassment. He was too smart for that. But the pressure was taking its toll on Marcus. He was losing weight because the stress was affecting his appetite. He was sleeping even less than before, which was saying something for someone who already had nightmares about Afghanistan. The other soldiers in the unit began to notice the change in him. Private Tommy, his roommate, was especially worried. "You look terrible, man," Tommy said one evening. "When was the last time you ate a full meal?" Marcus looked at the untouched tray of food on his desk. He had brought it back from the mess hall but had no desire to eat it. "I am fine," he said automatically. "No, you're not fine. Nobody is fine when they are being treated like this. You should talk to someone." "Like who?" Marcus asked. "The chaplain, the base counselor, and tell them what? That my commanding officer does not like me?" Tommy did not have an answer for that. In the military, soldiers were expected to handle problems on their own. Asking for help was often seen as weakness. Meanwhile, Whitman's behavior was becoming more obvious to others on the base. During a meeting with other unit commanders, Major Patricia Collins mentioned what she had observed. "Brad, I have noticed some tension in your unit lately," she said carefully. "Is everything okay with your logistics team?" Whitman bristled at the suggestion that anything was wrong with his command. "My unit operates at peak efficiency, Pat. If you are seeing tension, it is probably because we maintain higher standards than some other units." "I am not questioning your standards," Collins replied. "I just noticed that you seem to be particularly hard on one of your sergeants. Rivera, I think his name is. Sergeant Rivera is a discipline problem," Whitman said firmly. "He has trouble adjusting to proper military protocol. I am helping him improve." Collins knew Marcus by reputation. She had heard about his service record and his decorations. The idea that he was a discipline problem seemed unlikely. "Brad, the man has a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. How much of a discipline problem could he be?" Whitman's face reddened. "Combat ribbons do not automatically make someone a good soldier, Pat. Some of these veterans come back thinking they are special. They need to learn that every assignment matters, not just the exciting ones." Collins decided not to push the issue further, but she made a mental note to keep watching the situation. Back in the logistics unit, Marcus was struggling more each day. His work remained perfect, but the constant stress was wearing him down. He found himself making small mistakes in his personal life, forgetting to shave closely enough, leaving his locker slightly disorganized, missing calls from his sister. These small failures only reinforced the voice in his head that said maybe Whitman was right. Maybe he was not good enough. Maybe his military career was over. One afternoon, Marcus was assigned to inventory medical supplies in a storage building at the far edge of the base. It was a job that should have taken 2 people, but Whitman sent him alone. The building was hot and poorly ventilated. After several hours of counting and recording items, Marcus began to feel dizzy. He sat down on a box to rest and suddenly found himself back in Afghanistan. The smell of dust and heat triggered a memory so vivid that for a moment he forgot where he was. He could hear the sound of helicopters overhead. He could smell smoke from burning vehicles. He could see the faces of Johnson and Martinez, his friends who did not make it home. Marcus shook his head and tried to focus on the present. But the memory would not go away. His hands were shaking as he tried to continue counting supplies. Sweat dripped onto the clipboard, making the ink run. When he finally finished the inventory and returned to the main building, it was past 1800 hours. Most of the unit had already gone to dinner. Marcus submitted his paperwork and headed back to his barracks. Whitman was waiting for him outside the building. "Rivera, He called out. "You are late." "Sir, you assigned me to complete the medical supply inventory. It took longer than expected because of the volume of items. I gave you until 1700 hours to finish that job. Are you telling me you cannot handle a simple inventory in the time I allowed?" Marcus felt exhaustion washing over him. The flashback had drained what little energy he had left. "The job is complete, sir. All items are accounted for and properly documented." "That is not what I asked you," Whitman said, stepping closer. "I asked if you are capable of completing assigned tasks in a reasonable time frame." Other soldiers walking by slowed down to listen. Word of these confrontations had spread throughout the base. Some people came to watch out of curiosity. Others hoped someone would finally stand up to Whitman. "I completed the task as assigned, sir," Marcus repeated. "Barely," Whitman said loudly, "and only after taking all day to do what should have been a few hours of work." "This is exactly the kind of poor performance I have been talking about." Marcus said nothing. He had learned that anything he said would only make things worse. "You know what I think, Rivera?" Whitman continued. "I think you are used to the easy life of a combat zone, where nobody expects much from you except staying alive. Well, this is the real army. Here we have standards. Here we expect excellence every single day." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Easy life of a combat zone. Whitman had no idea what he was talking about. Marcus had spent months watching for roadside bombs, never knowing if each patrol would be his last. He had held dying friends in his arms. He had made decisions that meant the difference between life and death for the men under his command, but he could not say any of that. The morning of November 11th dawned crisp and clear at Fort Henderson. Veterans Day was always a special occasion on military bases, and this year would be no different. The entire base was preparing for a ceremony to honor fallen soldiers from recent conflicts. Flags hung at half-staff, and soldiers spent extra time making sure their dress uniforms were perfect. Marcus Rivera stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, with his Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and other ribbons arranged precisely according to regulations. But his hands were shaking slightly as he worked. Something about today felt different. Maybe it was the solemnity of the occasion, or maybe it was the stress of the past month under Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's constant harassment. Either way, Marcus felt on edge in a way that reminded him of bad days in Afghanistan. "You look good, Sergeant," said Private Tommy, his roommate. "Those ribbons really stand out." Marcus nodded but did not smile. The ribbons felt heavy on his chest today. Each one represented moments he would rather forget. The Purple Heart especially seemed to burn against his uniform, reminding him of the explosion that changed everything. At 0900 hours, the entire base assembled on the main parade ground. Hundreds of soldiers stood in perfect formation, facing a small stage decorated with American flags and wreaths. Family members filled bleachers set up for the occasion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the field. Marcus stood with his unit trying to focus on the ceremony and not on the memories that were trying to surface. Next to him, other soldiers stood proudly. For most of them, this was a day of honor and remembrance. For Marcus, it was becoming something else entirely. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Matthews, took the stage first. She spoke about sacrifice and service, about the men and women who had given their lives for their country. Her words were respectful and heartfelt, but Marcus found it hard to concentrate. The formal language and ceremonial tone reminded him too much of military funerals he had attended. Then came the honor guard, 8 soldiers in pristine uniforms carrying rifles. They marched onto the field with precise steps, their movements synchronized perfectly. Marcus watched them approach and felt his breathing become shallow. Colonel Matthews continued her speech, reading the names of soldiers from Fort Henderson who had died in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 5 years. Each name was followed by a moment of silence. Marcus recognized some of the names. He had served with a few of these men in different units. As the list continued, Marcus felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides. The formal ceremony was triggering memories he had worked hard to suppress. Then Colonel Matthews announced the final part of the ceremony. A 21-gun salute to honor all fallen soldiers. The honor guard raised their rifles and took aim at the sky. Marcus knew what was coming, but he could not prepare himself for it. When the first volley of shots rang out, the sound hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, he was not on a parade ground in Texas. He was back in Afghanistan, and the sound of gunfire meant danger. His heart began racing. His breathing became rapid and shallow. The world around him seemed to shift and blur. The second volley fired, and Marcus flinched visibly. The soldier next to him noticed and gave him a concerned look, but Marcus did not see it. All he could see were the faces of Johnson and Martinez, his friends who had died in the roadside bombing. All he could hear was the sound of explosions and screaming. The third volley was the worst. As the rifles fired, Marcus dropped to one knee, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was not there. For several seconds, he was completely lost in the flashback, believing he was under attack. The ceremony continued around him, but Marcus was no longer part of it. He was trapped in his own mind, reliving the worst day of his military career. Several soldiers nearby noticed his distress, but they were not sure what to do without disrupting the formal ceremony. It took nearly a minute for Marcus to realize where he was. Slowly, the sounds of the present began to break through the sounds of the past. He heard the bass band playing taps. He felt the cool morning air on his face. He saw hundreds of soldiers standing at attention around him. Marcus struggled to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment. He had just had a panic attack in front of the entire base, during a ceremony honoring fallen soldiers, on the most solemn day of the military calendar. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman had been standing with the other unit commanders near the stage. He had seen everything. As the ceremony concluded, and soldiers began to file off the parade ground, Whitman made his way through the crowd toward Marcus. Marcus was still trying to compose himself when Whitman appeared beside him. The other soldiers in the unit quickly found reasons to be somewhere else, leaving Marcus alone with his commanding officer. "Rivera," Whitman said in a voice loud enough for others to hear. "What exactly was that display supposed to be?" Marcus tried to find words, but his mouth was dry and his thoughts were still scattered. "Sir, I apologize for—" "You apologize?" Whitman interrupted. "You just disrupted a solemn ceremony honoring our fallen heroes, and you think an apology is sufficient?" Other soldiers and family members were still within earshot. Some turned to look at the confrontation developing between the officer and the sergeant. Marcus felt exposed and vulnerable, like an animal caught in a trap. "Sir, I had a momentary reaction to the rifle fire. It will not happen again." "A momentary reaction?" Whitman said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call making a scene during a Veterans Day ceremony? Is that what you call embarrassing this entire unit in front of the whole base?" Marcus could see people watching them now. Soldiers, officers, family members, all of them witnesses to his humiliation. He wanted to explain about the flashbacks, about the PTSD that he had never acknowledged or treated. But he knew Whitman would only use that information against him. "You know what I think, Rivera?" Whitman continued, stepping closer so that Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath. "I think you are mentally unfit for military service. I think whatever happened to you over there broke something inside you that cannot be fixed." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. For weeks he had endured Whitman's harassment in silence. He had accepted unfair assignments and unjust criticism without complaint. But this was different. This was attacking his very fitness as a soldier. "Sir, I respectfully disagree with that assessment," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Respectfully disagree?" Whitman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sergeant, you just proved my point. A soldier who cannot handle the sound of ceremonial gunfire has no business being in the Army. You are a liability to this unit and to every soldier who might have to depend on you." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced it down. Losing his temper would only prove Whitman's point. Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse, but several people were still watching the confrontation with obvious interest. "I have reviewed your performance over the past month," Whitman continued, "and I am convinced that you do not belong in this unit. In fact, I am not sure you belong in the Army at all anymore." The threat was clear now. Whitman was not just harassing him anymore. He was building a case to have Marcus removed from the military entirely. "Perhaps it is time to consider whether you might be happier in civilian life," Whitman said. "There are programs to help soldiers like you transition out of the military. Soldiers who are no longer capable of meeting our standards." Marcus felt the world spinning around him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, was being threatened by this man who had never seen real combat. His military career, his identity, his future, all of it was hanging in the balance. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, I have given 12 years of my life to this army. I have served my country with honor and distinction. I respectfully request that you reconsider your assessment of my fitness for duty." 12 years, Whitman repeated. "And what do you have to show for it?" "A few ribbons and a tendency to fall apart under pressure. Sergeant, the Army has changed since you joined. We need soldiers who can handle stress, not soldiers who create it." The conversation was attracting more attention now. Major Patricia Collins, who had been talking with other officers near the stage, noticed the heated discussion and began walking over. Several enlisted soldiers were also watching from a distance, their faces showing a mixture of sympathy for Marcus and fear of Whitman. "I will be reviewing your case with the base commander," Whitman said, raising his voice slightly. "I suspect she will agree with me that soldiers who cannot maintain composure during simple ceremonies are not fit for continued service." "Colonel Whitman?" came a voice from behind them. Major Collins had arrived, and her tone suggested she had heard enough of the conversation. "Major Collins," Whitman replied, turning to face her. "I was just discussing performance issues with Sergeant Rivera." Collins looked at Marcus, who was standing rigidly at attention, his face pale but determined. She had watched the entire ceremony and had seen what happened during the rifle salute. She had also seen how quickly Whitman had moved to confront Marcus about it. Brigadier General Sarah Chen had not planned to attend the Veterans Day ceremony at Fort Henderson. She was supposed to be in Washington, D.C. for a meeting with Pentagon officials, but the meeting had been postponed at the last minute. Instead of returning to her headquarters at Fort Hood, she decided to make an unannounced visit to several bases in her command area. General Chen believed in seeing her units without advance notice. Too often, commanders prepared special shows when they knew a general was coming. They cleaned everything extra well, rehearsed their briefings, and made sure only the best soldiers were visible. Chen wanted to see how her bases really operated when nobody was trying to impress her. She arrived at Fort Henderson early that morning in an unmarked vehicle, wearing simple utility fatigues with her rank insignia removed. To most soldiers, she looked like any other officer visiting the base. She parked near the main gate and walked onto the installation, observing everything around her. Chen had served 22 years in the Army, including 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous areas of both countries. She had lost soldiers under her command, and she carried those losses with her every day. Unlike many general officers, Chen had risen through the ranks by taking care of her soldiers first and worrying about politics second. She believed that an army was only as strong as its weakest member, and that every soldier deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As she walked around Fort Henderson that morning, Chen noticed several things. The base was well maintained and the soldiers appeared professional. But there was something in the atmosphere that bothered her. She could not put her finger on it, but something felt wrong. When she heard about the Veterans Day ceremony, Chen decided to attend as an observer. She found a spot near the back of the crowd where she could watch without drawing attention to herself. From there, she had a clear view of the entire parade ground. The ceremony proceeded normally at first. Chen listened to Colonel Matthews' speech and watched the honor guard prepare for the rifle salute. She noticed one soldier in particular who seemed tense and uncomfortable. He was standing with what appeared to be a logistics unit, a staff sergeant with several ribbons on his chest. When the first rifle volley fired, Chen saw the sergeant flinch. When the second volley fired, she saw him begin to shake. By the third volley, the man had dropped to one knee, clearly experiencing some kind of flashback or panic attack. Chen recognized the signs immediately. She had seen them in her own soldiers during combat deployments. She had seen them in herself after particularly difficult missions. What she was witnessing was a combat veteran having a PTSD episode triggered by the ceremonial gunfire. What happened next made Chen's blood boil. Instead of showing concern for a soldier in distress, she watched as a lieutenant colonel approached the sergeant and began berating him publicly. Even from a distance, Chen could hear the officer's harsh words and see the soldier's obvious embarrassment and pain. Chen moved closer through the dispersing crowd, wanting to hear exactly what was being said. What she heard confirmed her worst fears about the lieutenant colonel's character and leadership style. The officer was not just criticizing the sergeant's behavior. He was attacking the man's fitness for duty, questioning his mental stability and threatening his military career. All of this was happening in public, in front of other soldiers and family members, on a day that was supposed to honor military service. Chen listened in growing anger as the lieutenant colonel continued his verbal assault. She heard him suggest that the sergeant was mentally unfit for military service, and that he might be happier in civilian life. These were not the words of a leader trying to help a struggling soldier. These were the words of a bully trying to destroy someone. When Major Collins intervened and the confrontation finally ended, Chen watched the lieutenant colonel walk away with obvious satisfaction. She also watched the sergeant stand alone on the parade ground, clearly devastated by what had just happened to him. Chen made a mental note of the lieutenant colonel's name tag, Whitman. She also noted the sergeant's name, Rivera. Then she quietly followed Whitman as he headed toward the base headquarters building. Chen had seen enough bad officers during her career to recognize one immediately. Whitman carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his rank made him better than the soldiers under his command. He showed no concern for the sergeant he had just humiliated. In fact, he seemed pleased with himself. Over the next several hours, Chen conducted her own informal investigation. She visited the base exchange, the dining facility, and other common areas where soldiers gathered. She listened to conversations and asked casual questions about life at Fort Henderson. What she learned disturbed her greatly. Soldiers spoke in whispers about Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's treatment of his unit. They described a commander who ruled through fear and intimidation. They told stories of good soldiers being driven out of the army because they could not meet Whitman's impossible standards. Most concerning to Chen were the stories about Sergeant Rivera specifically. Multiple soldiers described weeks of harassment and abuse directed at a decorated combat veteran. They talked about unfair work assignments, denied leave requests, and daily humiliation in front of other soldiers. One young private, speaking quietly in the dining facility, summed up the situation perfectly. Colonel Whitman has it out for Sergeant Rivera and nobody knows why. Rivera is a good soldier, but Whitman treats him like dirt. We all feel bad for the guy, but nobody wants to say anything because they are afraid of becoming the next target. Chen also learned about Rivera's combat record: Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Action Badge. The man had served multiple deployments and had been wounded in action. He was exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed to retain, not drive away. That evening, Chen made several phone calls from her hotel room. She contacted the Inspector General's office and requested Rivera's complete military file. She also asked for any previous complaints filed against Whitman and his unit's performance statistics. What she discovered was even worse than she had suspected. Rivera's file showed an exemplary military career with consistently excellent performance evaluations. His combat record was outstanding, and his previous commanders had all rated him as one of their best non-commissioned officers. Whitman's file told a different story. While he had never been formally disciplined, there were several informal complaints about his leadership style. More tellingly, his unit had the highest turnover rate of any logistics unit in the region. Good soldiers were constantly requesting transfers or leaving the Army entirely, rather than continue serving under his command. Chen spent most of the night reading files and making plans. By morning, she had decided to extend her stay at Fort Henderson and conduct a formal investigation into Whitman's unit. The next day, Chen returned to the base in her general's uniform with her full-rank insignia displayed. This time she announced herself properly at the headquarters building and requested a meeting with Colonel Matthews. The base commander, General Chen, Matthews said, clearly surprised by the unannounced visit. "I was not expecting you. How can I help you?" "I am here to discuss some concerns about leadership and soldier welfare," Chen replied. "Specifically, I want to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's unit." Matthews looked uncomfortable. "Is there a specific problem, ma'am?" "There might be," Chen said carefully. "I observed some interactions yesterday that concerned me. I would like to conduct some interviews with soldiers in that unit if you do not mind." Matthews agreed, though Chen could tell she was nervous about what the investigation might reveal. No base commander wanted a general asking questions about problem officers. Over the next 2 days, Chen conducted formal interviews with a dozen soldiers from Whitman's unit. She spoke with them privately in a secure room, with assurances that there would be no retaliation for honest answers. What she heard confirmed everything she had suspected and more. "Soldier, After Soldier described a toxic command climate where fear was the primary motivator, they talked about impossible standards, unfair punishments, and constant criticism. Several soldiers mentioned Rivera specifically, describing him as a good leader who was being systematically destroyed by Whitman's harassment. Sergeant Williams was particularly helpful. As the senior non-commissioned officer in the unit, he had witnessed most of Whitman's behavior toward Rivera. "General, I have been in the Army for 12 years," Williams said. "I have never seen an officer target a soldier the way Colonel Whitman has targeted Sergeant Rivera. It is not leadership. It is bullying, plain and simple." "Can you give me specific examples?" Chen asked. Williams provided a detailed account of the past month's events. The daily uniform inspections that no one else had to endure, the menial work assignments given to a staff sergeant, the denied leave requests, the public humiliation during unit meetings. "The worst part," Williams said, "is that Rivera just takes it. He never complains, never fights back, never even looks angry. But you can see it is killing him inside. He has lost weight, he does not sleep, and he barely talks to anyone anymore." Chen asked Williams about Rivera's work performance. "Flawless." Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Whitman walked into the conference room with his usual confident stride. He had spent extra time that morning making sure his uniform was perfect. Meeting with a general was always an opportunity to make a good impression and advance his career. Whitman had heard that Brigadier General Chen was visiting the base, but he assumed it was just a routine inspection. He had no reason to worry. His unit's paperwork was in order, his soldiers followed regulations, and his efficiency reports looked good on paper. "General Chen," Whitman said, saluting smartly as he entered the room, "thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I hope you have been impressed with what you have seen at Fort Henderson." Chen did not return his smile. She gestured to a chair across from her and waited for him to sit down. On the table between them were several thick folders and a legal pad covered with notes. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitman," Chen began, her voice formal and serious, "I am here conducting an investigation into command climate and soldier welfare in your unit. I have some questions I need you to answer." The word investigation hit Whitman like a cold slap. His confident expression faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Of course, General," he said carefully. "I am happy to assist with any investigation. My unit operates according to the highest standards of military excellence." Chen opened the first folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Let me start with some statistics. Your unit has had a turnover rate of 43% over the past 12 months. That is nearly twice the average for similar units. Can you explain why so many soldiers are leaving your command?" Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had hoped those numbers would not be noticed by higher headquarters. "General, I maintain very high standards in my unit," he said. "Some soldiers find it difficult to meet those standards and choose to transfer or leave the Army. I believe this actually improves our overall effectiveness by keeping only the most dedicated soldiers." "I see," Chen said, making a note on her legal pad. "And what about your unit's morale assessments? You have consistently scored in the bottom 10% of all units on this base." Whitman felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "General, morale surveys can be misleading. Soldiers sometimes complain when they are being held to proper standards. I focus on results, not popularity." Chen pulled out another document. "Speaking of results, your unit has had more formal complaints filed against it in the past year than any other unit of comparable size. Complaints about unfair treatment, denial of leave, and hostile work environment. How do you explain that?" "Disgruntled soldiers sometimes file complaints when they face consequences for poor performance," Whitman replied. "I review each complaint carefully, but I do not let false accusations prevent me from maintaining discipline." Chen studied Whitman's face as he answered. She could see him becoming more defensive with each question. She could also see that he genuinely believed his own explanations. "Let me ask you about a specific soldier," Chen said. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera. Can you tell me about his performance in your unit?" Whitman's jaw tightened at the mention of Rivera's name. "Sergeant Rivera has been a discipline problem since he arrived. He has difficulty adjusting to proper military standards after his combat deployment. I have been working to help him improve, but his progress has been limited." "Help him improve?" Chen repeated. "Can you describe what kind of help you have been providing?" "Additional training, extra attention to detail, frequent performance counseling," Whitman said. Sometimes soldiers coming back from combat deployments need more structure and guidance to readjust to garrison life. Chen opened another folder and spread several documents on the table. I have been reviewing Sergeant Rivera's personnel file. He has consistently excellent performance evaluations from his previous assignments, multiple commendations for leadership and technical expertise, a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his combat service. Does this sound like a soldier who needs help meeting basic military standards? Whitman looked at the documents but did not touch them. General, past performance does not always predict future success. Combat veterans sometimes struggle with the transition to peacetime duties. Rivera's previous commanders may have been more lenient due to his combat experience. More lenient? Chen's voice had an edge to it now. Lieutenant Colonel, are you suggesting that multiple senior officers falsified this soldier's evaluations? Not falsified, Whitman said quickly, but perhaps they were influenced by sympathy for his combat service rather than objective assessment of his performance. Chen leaned back in her chair and studied Whitman for a moment. She was beginning to understand exactly what kind of officer she was dealing with. Let me tell you what I have learned during my investigation, Chen said. I have interviewed 12 soldiers from your unit. Every single one of them described a command climate based on fear and intimidation. They described a leader who rules through punishment rather than inspiration. Whitman started to speak, but Chen held up her hand to stop him. I am not finished, she continued. Multiple soldiers described witnessing you systematically harass Sergeant Rivera over the past month. They described unfair work assignments, denied leave requests, public humiliation, and threats to his career. They described a good soldier being slowly destroyed by a commanding officer who seems determined to break him. General, I object to the characterization of firm leadership as harassment, Whitman said, his voice rising slightly. Sergeant Rivera has performance issues that need to be addressed. If soldiers perceive correction as harassment, that reflects their own lack of discipline. Chen opened the final folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. These are sworn statements from soldiers in your unit. Would you like me to read some of them? Whitman's face had gone pale, but he nodded. Chen picked up the first statement and began reading. Private Johnson states, Colonel Whitman makes Sergeant Rivera do jobs that privates usually do, like cleaning bathrooms and washing vehicles. When other sergeants get important assignments, Rivera gets punished with menial labor. It is obvious that the colonel has it out for him. She picked up another statement. Sergeant Williams states, Colonel Whitman requires Rivera to report for uniform inspection every morning, something no other soldier has to do. Even when Rivera's uniform is perfect, the colonel finds something to criticize. This is clearly harassment designed to humiliate a good soldier. Chen continued reading statement after statement. Each one described specific incidents of unfair treatment directed at Rivera. Each one painted a picture of systematic harassment that went far beyond normal military discipline. As the evidence mounted, Whitman began to realize that his career was in serious jeopardy. But instead of accepting responsibility, he became more defensive. General, these soldiers do not understand the full picture, he said desperately. Rivera is a security risk. His combat experience has left him mentally unstable. I witnessed him have a breakdown during the Veterans Day ceremony. He is not fit for duty, and I have been trying to document that fact for the good of the unit. Chen's eyes flashed with anger. A security risk? Lieutenant Colonel, are you seriously suggesting that a decorated combat veteran is a threat to military security because he had a PTSD episode triggered by ceremonial gunfire? He cannot handle stress, General. What happens if we deploy and he breaks down under pressure? What happens if his mental instability affects other soldiers? Chen stood up from her chair, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman, you clearly have no understanding of combat stress, PTSD, or how to properly care for soldiers who have sacrificed for their country. Your attitude toward Sergeant Rivera is not just unprofessional, it is disgraceful. Whitman realized he had made a serious mistake, but it was too late to take back his words. General, I was only trying to... You were trying to destroy a good soldier because his combat experience makes you feel inadequate, Chen interrupted. You were using your rank to bully someone who has done things you never had the courage to do yourself. Chen sat back down and picked up her legal pad. Let me tell you what is going to happen next. I am recommending formal charges against you for conduct unbecoming an officer, creating a hostile work environment, and failure to properly care for soldiers under your command. Whitman's face went white. General, surely we can resolve this without formal charges. I am willing to adjust my leadership style if that is what you think is needed. It is too late for adjustments, Chen replied coldly. You have had months to change your behavior, and instead you escalated your harassment of Sergeant Rivera. You have created a toxic command climate that has driven good soldiers out of the Army. Most importantly, you have shown that you fundamentally do not understand what it means to be a leader. Chen gathered the documents from the table and placed them back in their folders. You are relieved of command effective immediately. Major Collins will assume temporary command of your unit while these charges are processed. General, please reconsider, Whitman said, his voice now desperate. I have 15 years in the Army. This will end my career. You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy Sergeant Rivera's career, Chen replied. The military courtroom at Fort Henderson was packed with spectators on the morning of Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Whitman's court-martial. Word had spread quickly throughout the base about the charges against the former commanding officer. Soldiers, officers, and even some civilian employees had come to witness what many saw as long overdue justice. Marcus Rivera sat in the front row of the witness section, wearing his dress blue uniform with all his ribbons and decorations. He had not wanted to attend the proceedings, but General Chen had convinced him that his presence was important for other soldiers to see. This is not just about you, Sergeant, Chen had told him. This is about showing every soldier on this base that the Army will protect them from toxic leadership. Your presence here sends that message. At the defendant's table, Whitman sat with his military defense attorney looking pale and defeated. The confident officer who had terrorized his unit for months was gone, replaced by a man facing the destruction of his career and reputation. The charges against Whitman were serious: conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, creating a hostile work environment, failure in his duty to properly care for soldiers under his command, and violation of equal opportunity regulations. If convicted on all counts, he faced dismissal from the Army, loss of all benefits, and possible jail time. Colonel James Harrison, the military judge presiding over the case, called the court to order. This court-martial will address charges brought against Lieutenant Colonel Bradley J. Whitman. Major Williams, you may present the government's case. Major Rachel Williams, the prosecutor assigned to the case, stood and addressed the court. She was a sharp, experienced military lawyer who had prosecuted several high-profile cases involving officer misconduct. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Lieutenant Colonel Whitman engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and abuse directed at Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera, a decorated combat veteran. This harassment was based not on any legitimate performance concerns, but on the defendant's personal animosity toward a soldier whose combat experience highlighted his own lack of military accomplishment. The defense attorney, Captain Mike Thompson, immediately objected. Your Honor, the prosecution is speculating about my client's motivations without evidence. Sustained, Judge Harrison ruled. Major Williams, stick to the facts. Yes, Your Honor, Williams replied. The facts will show that Lieutenant Colonel Whitman subjected Sergeant Rivera to treatment that no soldier should endure under any circumstances. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution methodically built their case. They called witness after witness from Whitman's unit, each one describing the toxic command climate and the specific harassment directed at Rivera. Sergeant Williams was one of the first witnesses. He described in detail the daily uniform inspections that only Rivera had to endure, the menial work assignments given to a staff sergeant, and the constant public humiliation. Sir, I have been in the Army for 12 years, Williams testified. I have served under many different commanders. I have never seen an officer single out a soldier for harassment the way Lieutenant Colonel Whitman targeted Sergeant Rivera. Can you give the court a specific example? Major Williams asked. Yes, ma'am. There was an incident where Sergeant Rivera was assigned to inventory medical supplies in a hot, poorly ventilated building. It was a job that normally requires 2 people, but Colonel Whitman sent him alone. When Rivera finished, late because of the volume of work, Colonel Whitman publicly berated him in front of other soldiers, calling his performance unacceptable. Private Tommy Chen, Rivera's roommate, testified about the changes he witnessed in Rivera during his time under Whitman's command. Sir, when Sergeant Rivera first arrived, he was quiet but seemed okay, Tommy said. But after a few weeks under Colonel Whitman, he stopped eating regular meals, barely slept, and hardly talked to anyone. I could see the stress was destroying him. Major Patricia Collins took the stand to describe what she had witnessed during the Veterans Day ceremony and its aftermath. Your Honor, I watched Lieutenant Colonel Whitman publicly humiliate a soldier who was clearly experiencing a PTSD episode, Collins testified. Instead of showing concern for Sergeant Rivera's welfare, the defendant used his distress as an opportunity to attack his fitness for duty. It was one of the most unprofessional displays I have ever witnessed from a senior officer. The most powerful testimony came from General Chen herself. As the investigating officer, she described in detail what she had discovered during her review of Whitman's unit. Your Honor, in my 22 years of military service, including 3 combat deployments, I have never encountered such a clear case of systematic harassment and toxic leadership, Chen testified. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman created an environment where good soldiers feared for their careers simply for serving under his command. When Major Williams asked Chen to describe Rivera's qualifications and service record, the general's voice filled with pride. Sergeant Rivera is exactly the kind of soldier the Army needs to retain, Chen said. He has served with distinction in combat, earned multiple decorations for valor, and continued to perform his duties flawlessly, even while being subjected to daily harassment. His resilience and professionalism under these circumstances demonstrate exceptional character. The prosecution also presented evidence of Whitman's pattern of behavior beyond just Rivera. They showed documentation of the unit's high turnover rate, low morale scores, and multiple informal complaints about Whitman's leadership style. When it came time for the defense, Captain Thompson faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and Whitman's own statements during General Chen's investigation had been damaging. Thompson's strategy was to argue that Whitman was simply a demanding leader who held his soldiers to high standards. He suggested that the charges were an overreaction to legitimate military discipline. Your Honor, my client was attempting to correct performance deficiencies in a soldier who was struggling to adjust after combat deployment, Thompson argued. While his methods may have been strict, they were within the bounds of military authority. But this defense fell apart when the prosecution called Rivera himself to the witness stand. Rivera walked to the front of the courtroom with military bearing, his ribbons and decorations clearly visible on his chest. He was sworn in and took his seat, looking directly at the judge rather than at Whitman. Sergeant Rivera, Major Williams began, please tell the court about your military service prior to arriving at Fort Henderson. Rivera spoke clearly and concisely about his 12 years in the Army, his multiple deployments, and his combat experience. He described the roadside bombing that earned him his Purple Heart and the actions that led to his Bronze Star. Sergeant, during your time in Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's unit, how would you describe your work performance? Williams asked. Ma'am, I completed every assignment on time and without errors. I followed all military regulations and maintained military bearing at all times. I tried to exceed expectations in everything I was asked to do. And how would you describe Lieutenant Colonel Whitman's treatment of you? Rivera paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Whitman held me to standards that were different from other soldiers in the unit. He required daily inspections that others did not have to undergo. He assigned me duties that were below my rank and experience level. He criticized my performance in front of other soldiers even when my work was completed correctly. How did this treatment affect you personally? Rivera's voice remained steady, but those who knew him could see the emotion in his eyes. Ma'am, it made me question my value as a soldier and my future in the Army. I began to doubt abilities that had been proven in combat. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and withdrew from interactions with other soldiers. Sergeant Rivera, did you ever consider filing a complaint against Lieutenant Colonel Whitman? No, ma'am. I believed that complaining about my chain of command would only make things worse. I hoped that if I continued to perform well, the situation would improve. When Captain Thompson cross-examined Rivera, he tried to suggest that the sergeant's combat experience had left him unable to handle normal military discipline. Sergeant Rivera, is it true that you had a panic attack during the Veterans Day ceremony? Yes, sir. The ceremonial rifle fire triggered a flashback to combat. It was a momentary reaction that I quickly controlled. And this kind of reaction demonstrates that you may not be fit for continued military service, does it not? Rivera straightened in his chair. No, sir. Experiencing PTSD symptoms does not make a soldier unfit for duty. With proper support and understanding, combat veterans can continue to serve effectively. Many of the finest soldiers I know have dealt with similar challenges. Thompson's attempt to blame Rivera backfired completely. Instead of showing weakness, Rivera's honest acknowledgement of his PTSD and his determination to continue serving made him appear even more sympathetic to the court. The final blow to Whitman's defense came when Thompson called him to testify on his own behalf. Under oath, Whitman tried to justify his treatment of Rivera, but his answers only reinforced the prosecution's case. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitman," Thompson asked. 6 months after the court-martial, Marcus Rivera stood in his new office at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, looking out the window at soldiers conducting morning physical training. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves on the trees were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. Rivera was now assigned to the 101st Airborne Division's Logistics Command, working under Colonel David Martinez, a combat veteran who understood the challenges facing soldiers returning from deployment. The transfer had been arranged by General Chen, who wanted to ensure that Rivera had the opportunity to serve under competent leadership. The difference was like night and day. Colonel Martinez treated his soldiers with respect and dignity. He focused on developing their skills rather than finding fault with their performance. He understood that good soldiers sometimes struggled with personal issues and needed support rather than punishment. "Rivera," Colonel Martinez called from his office door. "Can you come in here for a minute?" Rivera walked into the colonel's office, where Martinez was reviewing a stack of performance evaluations. "I wanted to talk to you about your 6-month assessment," Martinez said, gesturing for Rivera to sit down. "Your work has been outstanding. Your fellow soldiers respect you, and your supervisors consistently rate you as one of their best non-commissioned officers." Rivera felt a warmth in his chest that he had almost forgotten was possible. For months at Fort Henderson, he had begun to doubt his own abilities. Now he was remembering what it felt like to be valued and appreciated. "Thank you, sir," Rivera replied. "I appreciate the opportunity to serve in this unit." "Marcus," Martinez said, using Rivera's first name in the informal atmosphere of his office, "I want to talk to you about something else. Have you given any thought to attending the Sergeant Major Academy?" Rivera was surprised by the question. The Sergeant Major Academy was the highest level of non-commissioned officer education, reserved for the Army's most promising leaders. "Sir, I had not really considered it," Rivera admitted. "Well, you should," Martinez said firmly. "You have the experience, the leadership ability, and the character that the Army needs in its senior enlisted ranks. I would like to recommend you for the next class." As Rivera left Colonel Martinez's office, he reflected on how much his life had changed since the dark days at Fort Henderson. The transfer to Fort Campbell had given him more than just a new assignment. It had given him a chance to heal and rediscover his purpose. In the Army, one of the most important changes had been his decision to seek help for his PTSD. General Chen had arranged for Rivera to meet with Dr. Sarah Thompson, a psychologist who specialized in treating combat veterans. At first, Rivera had been reluctant to talk about his experiences in Afghanistan. He had been conditioned to believe that seeking help was a sign of weakness. But Dr. Thompson helped him understand that dealing with trauma was actually a sign of strength. "Marcus," she had told him during one of their early sessions, "you would not hesitate to get medical treatment for a broken leg. Why should treatment for psychological wounds be any different?" Through counseling and therapy, Rivera learned to manage his PTSD symptoms. He developed coping strategies for dealing with triggers like loud noises or crowded spaces. More importantly, he learned to forgive himself for surviving when some of his friends had not. The therapy also helped him process his experience with Lieutenant Colonel Whitman. Rivera had carried guilt about the court-martial, feeling somehow responsible for destroying another man's career. Dr. Thompson helped him understand that Whitman's downfall was the result of his own choices, not Rivera's actions. "You did not cause what happened to him," Dr. Thompson explained. "You simply had the courage to tell the truth when someone asked. That is not something to feel guilty about. Rivera also reconnected with his sister Maria, who had been worried about him throughout the ordeal at Fort Henderson. When he finally told her what had happened, she was angry that he had not reached out for help sooner. "You are my only family, Marcus," she said during one of his visits home to Texas. "You do not have to carry these burdens alone. I will always be here for you." Maria had also started attending support groups for family members of veterans with PTSD. She learned how to recognize signs of distress and how to provide support without being overwhelming. At Fort Campbell, Rivera found himself becoming a mentor to younger soldiers, especially those who were struggling with their own challenges. His experience with adversity had given him insight into how to help others navigate difficult situations. Private Jason Miller was one soldier who particularly benefited from Rivera's guidance. Miller had returned from Afghanistan with visible scars from an IED explosion and was having trouble adjusting to garrison life. "Sergeant Rivera," Miller said one day after work, "I keep having nightmares about the explosion. I wake up sweating and shaking and I cannot get back to sleep." Rivera recognized the symptoms immediately. "Jason, have you talked to anyone about these nightmares?" "No, Sergeant. I do not want people to think I am weak." Rivera sat down with Miller and shared his own story. He talked about the roadside bombing that earned him his Purple Heart, the friends he had lost, and his own struggle with PTSD. "Getting help does not make you weak," Rivera explained. "It makes you smart. The strongest thing you can do is acknowledge when you need support and then go get it." With Rivera's encouragement, Miller began seeing a counselor and joined a support group for combat veterans. Over time, his nightmares became less frequent, and he regained his confidence as a soldier. News of Rivera's success at Fort Campbell eventually reached General Chen, who made a point of visiting him during one of her trips to the base. "Sergeant Rivera," Chen said as they walked around the base together, "I hear you are doing outstanding work here." "Thank you, General. Colonel Martinez is an excellent commander, and this unit has given me the opportunity to rebuild my career." Chen smiled. "I also hear you are helping other soldiers deal with combat stress and PTSD. That is exactly the kind of leadership the Army needs." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Chen spoke again. "Marcus, I want you to know that your case led to some important changes throughout the Army. We have implemented new training for commanders on recognizing and supporting soldiers with combat stress. We have also strengthened the procedures for investigating complaints about toxic leadership." Rivera felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that his ordeal had led to positive changes that would help other soldiers. "General, what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Whitman after the court-martial?" Rivera asked. Chen's expression grew serious. "He served his sentence and was dismissed from the Army. Last I heard, he was working as a security guard at a shopping mall in Ohio. His military career is over, and he will never have the opportunity to harm another soldier." As they continued their walk, Chen told Rivera about other changes that had been implemented at Fort Henderson. "Colonel Matthews retired early after your case revealed problems with oversight in her command," Chen explained. "The new base commander has made soldier welfare a top priority. The unit you served in has been completely restructured, with new leadership at every level." Rivera was glad to hear that Fort Henderson was becoming a better place for soldiers to serve. Too many good people had suffered under the previous leadership. Meanwhile, Sergeant Williams, who had been Rivera's supervisor during the dark days, had been promoted and transferred to a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon. His willingness to speak up during the investigation had been noted by senior leaders. "Williams called me last week," Rivera told Chen. "He said he has been telling your story to other non-commissioned officers. He wants them to understand the importance of taking care of soldiers, even when it means standing up to toxic leaders." As the months passed, Rivera continued to excel in his new assignment. He was selected for promotion to Sergeant First Class ahead of his peers. He was also chosen to attend advanced leadership courses that would prepare him for even greater responsibilities. But perhaps most importantly, Rivera had rediscovered his love for military service. The Army had always been more than just a job for him. It was a calling, a way to serve something bigger than himself. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman had nearly destroyed that sense of purpose. But good leadership and proper support had helped Rivera reclaim it. One day, Rivera received an unexpected phone call from a soldier at Fort Henderson. "Sergeant Rivera, my name is Specialist Anderson. I am calling because I heard about what happened to you there and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Rivera was confused. "For what?" "Sir, I was thinking about leaving the Army because of how I was being treated by my squad leader. But when I heard your story, and how you fought back against injustice, it inspired me to file a complaint instead of just giving up. The investigation led to my squad leader being removed, and now I have a chance to rebuild my career." Rivera felt tears forming in his eyes. This was why he had endured everything he had gone through. Not just for himself, but for soldiers like Anderson, who needed to know that the system would protect them if they had the courage to speak up. As Rivera hung up the phone, he looked around his office at Fort Campbell. On his desk were photos of his unit from Afghanistan, including the friends he had lost.